Hello, my name is Fiedorczuk, and this lecture will address the question of ecological intelligence. It's a concept which I propose to define as a kind of knowledge that involves scientific knowledge and the information that science gives us about the world, but that also goes beyond it towards the kinds of intuitions which are contained in art and perhaps especially in poetry. I would like us to begin by looking at a picture of Newton, a well-known picture of Newton, which was made by William Blake at the end of the 18th century. The picture epitomizes the poet's ambivalence towards the scientific revolution, which began in the 17th century. Blake depicts Newton sitting naked on a rock, drawing something with a pair of compasses, so completely absorbed with the straight line of his sketch that he is oblivious to the shapes around him. Behind him, the rock is vivid with texture, with colors, but the scientist doesn't pay attention to it because he's so absorbed with his tools and with this sketch that he's making. The drawing reflects Blake's skepticism towards science, towards the scientific revolution, which is beginning to gain momentum in the 18th century, and especially to the reductionism of instrumental rationality, which is gradually replacing religion as the dominant way of knowing. The new approach to the world, based on rationality, remains indifferent to such things as beauty, but also to the spiritual dimension of the universe, which is very important to Blake. And so for Blake, Newton, along with Locke and Francis Bacon, are misguided heroes. The scientific revolution gave a new impetus to the development of Western civilization. At the same time, as a consequence, the 18th century saw a greater impact of human actions on the environment. And this ambivalence is present in science from the very beginning. Because on the one hand, science, the scientific paradigm, is unquestionably our most reliable way of gaining knowledge about our planet. It's our most reliable source of knowledge about the Earth, about life, about this life-sustaining systems of this planet, about ourselves. That goes without saying, right? It is because of the scientific progress, because of the technological progress, that our lives have become much more comfortable and that our lives have become also much longer. This is clear, right? This no one is going to question. At the same time, the alliance of science with corporate capitalism makes for a super destructive force. The alliance of science with militarism also makes for a super destructive force. It's enough to mention weapons of mass destruction or chemical weapons, which are both products of technology, which is to say the application of science for military purposes, right? Agent Orange, which is going to come back in the last part of my talk and which was responsible for an immense amount of suffering during the Vietnam War. Human and non-human suffering is also a scientific achievement in some way, right? So this ambivalence of science is present from the very beginning. However, my position here is not to side with Blake and against Newton. Rather, I would like to suggest that this portrait of Newton by Blake contains a certain intuition, which is worth re-examining from our perspective today as to the lack of a certain kind of competence, lack of a certain kind of intelligence in this purely scientific or this purely rationally instrumental knowledge that the dominant scientific paradigm gives us. By depicting the scientist's indifference towards what cannot be measured, what cannot be represented by a specific set of tools, Blake shows the inherent limitations of this instrumental approach. It's not that this sort of instrumental knowledge, scientific knowledge, is incorrect. It's incomplete. While the measurements performed by Newton's tool are certainly accurate, they leave much out of the picture, leading to what contemporary evolutionary scientist Wendy Wheeler refers to as the modernity impasse, a consequence of the reductionist character of modern materialism and the objectification of non-human world as devoid of agency and meaning. According to the ecofeminist Caroline Merchant, 17th century science did indeed contribute to the most pressing ecological and social problems of our age, in fact, to what she describes as the death of nature. Merchant argues that the notion of a scientific revolution in 16th and 17th centuries is part of a larger mainstream narrative of Western culture that has propelled science, technology, and capitalism's effort to master nature. As Westerners, we have internalized this narrative of upward progress, and we have learned to identify with it, and we have learned to be actors in this narrative. Focusing especially on the rhetoric used by Bacon, Merchant highlights mechanistic science inclination not just to control, but actually to torture non-human nature. Blake's drawing also makes clear how our human sensitivity has been broken in two, how there are these two practically incompatible cultures or languages, right? The language of the scientist, here Newton represents this hard scientist, and then the language or the sensitivity of the artists, which is completely incompatible with that of the scientist. And I think that is one of the most unfortunate qualities of our contemporary intellectual life, that we still do have these two incompatible cultures that do not communicate with each other. There is no transfer really between the intuitions of art, the intuitions of poetry, for instance, and the knowledge, the information, the teaching that science gives us about the material world, about what is called nature. I believe that a lot of contemporary scientists, as well as a lot of contemporary artists, perhaps this is even stronger, this trend is even stronger among artists and poets, are beginning to understand that we urgently need a new kind of knowledge. We urgently need a new kind of competence that would combine the best intuitions of both. So in other words, my point is not to attack Newton and side with Blake, to go back to that picture that I showed you at the beginning. My point is that we need them both, but we need them to start talking with each other. What we just saw is a picture by Shoshana Dabiner. The title of the picture is Homage to Lynn Margulis. Lynn Margulis was a biologist whose research into microbiology changed our understanding of how life developed on our planet. And Dabiner attempts to represent this change, to represent a scientific revolution by means of her art. And so my idea in this talk is to make a somewhat outrageous claim that in order to develop this ecological intelligence, we need art, and perhaps especially we need poetry. So let me quote the American poet William Carlos Williams of the 20th century, who said, "It is difficult to get the news from poetry, yet men die miserably every day for the lack of what is found there." I love this quote very much, and I would like to spend the rest of this talk thinking about what it is that is found in poetry. And in order to try to begin to answer this question, I would like to quote a super famous poem by William Blake, who was the starting point for this talk. So the poem is Auguries of Innocence, and I'll just quote the first few opening lines of it. "To see the world in a grain of sand, heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. A robin redbreast in a cage puts all heaven in a rage. A dove house filled with doves and pigeons shudders hell through all its regions. A dog starved at his master's gate predicts the ruin of the state. A horse misused upon the road calls to heaven for human blood." What Blake's vision brings home is not just that torturing animals is morally wrong, obviously, but also that it impacts the entire universe, because no act ever is carried out in isolation. No one exists in isolation. All beings, all processes in the universe are entangled with all other beings and processes. So nothing ever happens that does not have impact on the entire universe. And this sort of intuition, right? This sort of deep intuition that our actions do influence the world is something that is present in Blake's poem, but absent from this reductivist, purely instrumental attitude towards the more than human nature that is represented by certain kinds of science, right? And so if this planet is not to die of the human, as another poet put it, contemporary poet Brenda Hillman, we need to figure out new ways of knowing that include both the information, both the understanding that even this instrumental science gives us, and this sort of poetic intuition about interconnectedness, about our entanglements with other beings, with other phenomena on this planet, that is present in Blake's poem and in other great poets. And so in what way can poetry help us to learn about the world and about ourselves? First of all, what are poems? Poems are units of sound and sense. As such, they call our attention to the inseparability of form and meaning, right? Of matter and meaning. Form and content could never be separated in poetry because poetry foregrounds the materiality of language, its sounds, its rhythms, the look of words on the page. So as new materialist philosophers, for example, Karen Barad, whose theory is inspired by quantum physics, speak about the inseparability of matter and meaning, of subject and object, of ontology and epistemology, of the world as a continuous performance of active elements that cannot be separated from each other. I think that poetry actually, of all the ways in which human beings use language, has the strongest potential for exploring these new ontologies. Poetry is a concentrated form of attention. And attention is something that we really badly need today. I don't think this needs to be explained, right? But we tend to be very, very distracted with information overload, with doing 5 million things at the same time, always being involved in many projects and so on and so forth. So we know what it's like. And poetry as a practice, the reading of poetry allows us to practice this concentrated form of attention, which is crucial if we are to notice the world around us. And noticing the world around us is the first step towards the ethics of care, towards engagement, towards wanting to be alive in the first place. Poetry is also a laboratory of the imagination. It's a laboratory of new metaphors, of new ways of thinking. Traditionally, this has been the task of poets. That's how a lot of poets have defined their work, as the work of revivifying language, right? Of reading language, of stale metaphors, phrases, of cliches, of everything that is obsolete, of everything that is inadequate. So in this sense, it's also a really great exercise in a more nuanced speaking, because that's the next quality of poetry, that it teaches nuance, that it leaves room for nuanced messages, which is at odds with the mainstream trends in contemporary culture, where communication tends to be extremely simplistic. We know this about social media, we know this about the mass media, right? That communication has to be very simple, it has to be polarizing, it has to address the most primitive emotions, right? So in this sense, poetry is the opposite of that, because it does make room for shades, it does make room for nuance. And I also believe that this is crucial for us in building this more ecological awareness, this more ecological sense of connectedness. In short, what I want to call the ecological intelligence. Poetry can also tell the truth in the sense of giving us access to reality in times when our lives have become largely virtual. Poetry can awaken human senses in working on a very deep bodily level of expression. It may help us to experience our life. It can help us to actually wake up to our lives. And being present in one's life, showing up for one's life, is actually a precondition for empathy, for engagement, and for change, right? So it can tell the truth, but it can also help us imagine the unimaginable, and that includes the possibility of joy. Even given the pessimistic scenarios we're faced with when we confront climate change and related planetary crisis. So let me quote another contemporary poet, Jory Graham. Jory Graham asks this question: how to live without our great capacity for joy, and why should we? She says, yes, it will be dark. Still, the gloaming is so rich with feeling and life, and perhaps a new kind of love. And the sensation of the other species' presence, and a slowing of fate, and a widening of presence, and a gratitude Why betray those feelings? So all of these ways which I have outlined address the kind of knowledge or the kind of intuition or the kind of experience that poetry can give us, which I think is invaluable, which I think is extremely valuable in these times, to accompany the kind of knowledge that science gives us. Because this deep way in which poetry works on our affects, in which it addresses the entire human subjectivity, not just the intellect, the entire human body, really, not just the intellect, I think is very crucial in order for us to wake up, to face our lives, to face reality, but also to have enough joy and enough hope in ourselves to want to live and to want to act and to want to change things. So in the last part of today's talk, I would like to address some new tendencies in the newest experimental poetry in Americas, actually. And I would like to discuss some new practices which I see developing in contemporary poetry in response to climate change, in response to the multiple planetary crises. So the first of these tendencies is what is sometimes referred to as documentary poetry. That's the kind of poetry that involves elements of nonfiction and also a kind of documentation that is involved in nonfiction. So there are poets who research specific cataclysms, environmental cataclysms, and write poems in response to these cataclysms that once again include information, right? Properly researched information, but also have this other aspect to it, the aspect of looking for a very special form, looking for a very unique form to convey this information. Another kind or another trend is research-based poetry. So I'll give an example of this sort of poetry in a moment. And that's the kind of poetry that actually uses the methodology of science in its procedure. And also what I think is crucially important nowadays is poetry that's written from non-Western perspective, bringing in non-Western epistemologies, but also indigenous languages and knowledges. There is a very, very strong trend now among First Nations to create poetry either in indigenous languages or in English, but involving elements of indigenous languages and indigenous competence. I believe that poetry can help in the task of decolonization. The task of decolonization is one of the most urgent tasks today. I think that's very clear when we look at global politics and when we look at the situation of indigenous peoples, of the First Nations. And as the indigenous scholars make clear, decolonization is not a metaphor, right? This needs to be underscored that in the first instance, decolonization involves the rights of indigenous peoples, of the First Nations, the protections of their cultures, the protection of their ways of engaging with the earth, of their languages, and so on and so forth. However, I do believe that there are other aspects of colonization which involves all of us in differing ways. So, for instance, I do think it is possible to say that our minds have been colonized by certain ways of speaking, certain ways of being, certain ways of thinking that privilege instrumental rationality, that privilege this attitude of extractive desire towards everything, towards non-human nature, towards the planet, but also towards our own bodies, towards our own time, right? We treat the language of economy as our cultural meta-language. So whatever we're speaking about profit, we're speaking about progress, we're speaking about, having as much, getting as much as possible out of this or that relationship, and so on and so forth. So in this sense, I do think that poetry can help counteract this sort of colonization of our minds by these mainstream ways of speaking and of thinking. Moreover, our bodies have also become colonized by chemical substances, including chemicals that have been produced by specific corporations. And this is the topic that is taken on by one of the poets, which I would like to discuss at the very end, Adam Dickinson. So his project is an example of what I referred to earlier as research-based poetry. The title of the project is Anatomic. And the point is to try to meditate on how, as he puts it, the outside writes the inside. That is to say, on how our environments write our bodies. It is possible to claim that our hormones are a form of writing, right? Hormones that decide about largely about the well-being of our bodies are a kind of writing. And in this sense, the hormone-disrupting chemicals, such as plastics, for instance, may be said to rewrite the texts of our bodies. Adam Dickinson uses strictly scientific methods, researching his body in collaboration with microbiologists, for instance, and other scientists, to create a kind of reading of his biota and of the chemical composition of his organisms. And then he composes a kind of a chemical autobiography, right? He composes poems which include which include the new knowledge, but which also situate this knowledge in global political contexts, what he calls our global petroculture, as well as in very intimate contexts, right? There are funny moments when he tells us about the process of testing, and there are scary and sad moments when he tells us about profound anxiety that follows after, getting certain results and finding out, for example, that one includes Monsanto. What you shall assume for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you, wrote the 19th century American poet Walt Whitman, to express his intuition of the interconnectedness of all nature, including humans, obviously, to express the sense that all living things on the planet are intimately linked with one another through our materiality. That was Whitman. What is inscribed in me is in you too, writes Adam Dickinson 170 years later, echoing Whitman, to express a new and strange kind of intimacy that is partly resulting from how the outside writes the inside, to how our environment write and rewrite our bodies in the Anthropocene. So let me just read the beginning of a poem from Anatomic. The title of the poem is Agents Orange, Yellow, and Red. You are either for chlorine or for the plague. Right now is the cleanest we have ever been. And for this, you must love aerial defoliants or you love communism. So this is just the beginning of a poem, and it mentions a number of chemicals, agents orange, yellow, and red, which were all used in the Vietnam War. They were among the so-called rainbow chemicals, rainbow agents that were used as chemical weapons simply, right? Defoliants are chemicals which are used against vegetation. And so one of the strategies during the Vietnam War was to destroy vegetation so that the enemy couldn't hide and that their food supplies were destroyed. So these chemicals are chemical weapons, but they are also used in agriculture. And because they are used in agriculture, they are present everywhere. They are present also in water, and they are present in our bodies. But chlorine is also an element of disinfectants. And so the poem is confronting us with a series of false alternatives, really, right? Either you're for chlorine, so either you're for chemicals, or for the plague, or for illness. Either you're for aerial defoliants, that is to say, Agent Orange, or you love communism, right? So in this way, Dickinson's poem is not simply against chemicals. It's not simply a criticism of our use of chemicals, but it shows how these chemical substances are not just chemicals, but that they also have certain cultural meanings and that they always exist in cultural, historical, and political contexts. I would like to close this lecture with simply reading a few fragments from another poet. This poet is Natalie Diaz, She's a Pulitzer-winning Mojave American poet who also writes about intimacy, but her project is informed with indigenous perspective and with the perspective of living in a non-white body in America. So I'm just going to read some excerpts from a poem titled "The First Water is the Body." The Colorado River is the most endangered river in the United States. Also, it is a part of my body. I carry a river. It is who I am. Ahamakav, this is not metaphor. This is not metaphor. Natives have been called red forever. I have never met a red native, not even on my reservation, not even at the National Museum for the American Indian, not even at the largest powwow in Parker, Arizona. I live in the desert, among a dammed blue river. The only red people I've seen are white tourists sunburned after staying out on the water too long. Ahamakav is the true name of our people, given to us by our Creator. Translated into English, Ahamakav means the river runs through the middle of our body. The same, it runs through the middle of our land. This is a poor translation, like all translations. When Mohavas say the word for tears, we return to our word for river, as if a river were flowing from our eyes. A great weeping is how you might translate it, or a river of grief. John Berger wrote, "True translation is not a binary affair between two languages, but a triangular affair. The third point of the triangle being what lay behind the word of the original text before it was written. The true translation demands a return to the pre-verbal." And so I'm going to suggest, and this will be my conclusion today, that the best kind of poetry is always this sort of translation. It always reverts to the pre-verbal. So what is it that poetry translates? It's a big question, right? But it does translate something. It does translate something that has to do with a very profound experience of ourselves as creatures that have bodies, as earthlings among other earthlings, right? As beings who are intimately entangled with other beings and other processes on the living earth. And as such, I think that poetry is a really crucial aspect of this new ecological intelligence or this new ecological competence that I would like to postulate, right? Because it gives us something that this traditional mainstream instrumental approach doesn't give us. It gives us this deep, sort of first-hand experience of connectedness. And I think this is the starting point for imagining, inventing, and creating new ways of thinking, new ways of living, new relationships, and to new scenarios, to writing new scenarios for the future, which are against the apocalypse.